So, welcome everyone for this final day of the Munich Security Conference. And I was thinking back at the Munich Security Conference last year, where Ambassador Heusgen, I think, made really quite a remarkable effort at trying to broaden out the conversation beyond the usual transatlantic crowd to the so-called global south. And I think actually this year that effort has been deepened and widened even further. However, it is fairly clear that our world is on the one hand more connected, but on the other hand ever more divided. And all this is happening, of course, against the backdrop of the war on Ukraine, but also of war in the Middle East, which has really, in many respects, made those divides much, much deeper and harder to reconcile. So to join me in this wonderful discussion for this final day of the Munich Security Conference, please join me in welcoming on stage Ricarda Lang. Ricarda is the co-chairwoman of Alliance 90, the Greens. Ricarda, please. David Lammy, Shadow Secretary of State of the Foreign, Common and Development Office of the United Kingdom. David. We have J.D. Vance, Senator from Ohio of the United States of America. And Priyanka Chaturvedi, Deputy Leader of the Shiv Sena Party of the Parliament of India. Priyanka. So, Ricarda, let me really start with you. There's been a lot of talk lately in Europe about the risk of a right-wing wave sweeping across Europe. And in many respects, the expectation of this has already had a number of implications, for instance, to issues which I guess are very dear to your heart, like climate policy. But looking beyond and looking at foreign policy specifically, I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit about what those implications might be for foreign policy questions broadly, but specifically for the European Union stance as far as Ukraine is concerned, and particularly in terms of both support for Ukraine, but also moving forward with the process of European enlargement. Ricarda.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having this session. I was born in 1994, so I'm a child of the 90s, and therefore I was very much born with the notion of the end of history. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the time of systematic competition is over, and with market liberalism all over the world, democracy and liberalism will spread. And this was very much what I grew up with, and also I think a notion when I started to go into politics. And this has dramatically changed throughout the last years. Because I think by now we are seeing that we are not so much standing in front of the question, how is democracy spreading worldwide, but far more, are democracies able to prevail internally when it comes to right extremists, for example, but also externally in a world that on the one hand, you mentioned that at the beginning, is so much more reliant on cooperation when we talk about climate change, migration and other issues, but on the other hand has drifted farther apart and cooperation has become more difficult. And so I think for us as Europe, this is the question, how can we strengthen our democracy and how can we prevail? This means economically, we need to have more of a geo-economic stance in the EU, and we need to be able to compete with China, also with the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act. This means internally, we need to come closer together. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about it later. Are we able to have a common foreign policy, for example, in the US, in Europe? Are we able to form better ties when it comes to defense? All those are questions. And of course, security-wise. And I think security-wise, the question of how we support Ukraine and whether Russia will win this war or not is of the utmost importance, because we know that if Putin is going to win this war against Ukraine, he and also other countries like China are going to learn that it is possible for them to just change borders, and this would mean, I think, for the world, less security, less freedom, and therefore the question if democracies prevail is also decided with the support of Ukraine.
Thank you. David, let me move on to you. You know, there hasn't been a lot of good news lately, understatement. But it has to be said that the European-UK relationship, the EU-UK relationship, actually has been a relatively bright spot. And it is very clear that looking ahead to your election towards the end of the year, I guess, that relationship might actually improve even further. Now, if on the one hand you have this sort of bilateral dynamic between the EU and the UK, which is going to be propelled even further by domestic dynamics within your country, and then on the other hand, we look at, and we'll be talking quite a bit about this, the looming risk of troubled waters across the Atlantic, could you perhaps say a little bit about how you foresee that EU-UK relationship developing, particularly in the security space?
Well, look, of course, I'm hoping that there is a general election this year, and I have the privilege of becoming the UK Foreign Secretary, because it's absolutely fundamental that the United Kingdom and Europe have the closest of relationships. And the Brexit era is over, the situation is settled, and what my party is proposing is a new UK-EU security pact. And it's a pact that is effectively built on the fact that we obviously have war here in Europe, but the truth is, and it's important that we summon up to the room the courage of Alexei Navalny. What it reminds us is that notwithstanding that war, Russia will continue to be a threat to Europe for months, years, perhaps a generation more. And that means that the defense capability of the UK, alongside our partners in France, particularly representing about 50% of Europe's defense capability, but also the intelligence capability of the Five Eyes system in partnership with the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, is absolutely essential, and it's why we need now a new security pact. Now, that security pact is not to rival NATO, it is to run in parallel with NATO, understanding that what we've seen from this crisis is that energy security is important for us to continue to work on, is that sanctions and bearing down on kleptocracy and the way in which misinformation and disinformation is being used in our democracies is important to bear down on. Security and migration is important to work together on. And of course, climate policy going forward. That's why we say we now need a UK-EU security pact. And the way I think to see this next period, and it came to me last night at an event with Mike Pompeo, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people, is that the threat to democracy at this point in time, and why we must stand together, comes down to one word: borders. It is a border that has been breached by Russia. It is our borders that are challenged by the problems in the Horn of Africa and climate as people migrate and move to better places. It is a border that is challenged between Israel and Gaza. And actually, when you look at the problems in passing the package of support to Ukraine, it is the border with the United States and Mexico and the huge, tremendous problems of fentanyl flooding into the United States that is holding up that package. We must protect our borders, and to do that, we have to stand together.
David, can I perhaps just press you, though, a little bit more on this point? I mean, I think you make a very important point, which is essentially, even in that hypothetical, highly desirable scenario in which Ukraine liberates all of its territory, Europe will continue to be in confrontation with Russia, given the situation internally within Russia. And hence, we have to prepare for a long war, which is not just a long war in Ukraine, but a potentially long war in a much broader sense of the term. Now, of course, there are all the elements that you describe, which are hugely important, but there is that hard defense angle, which is massively important in that kind of scenario. Could you perhaps say a little bit more, before I move on to Senator Vance, about how you foresee that security pact actually sort of playing out in that defense field? In what ways, for instance, would it move forward in terms of encouraging not only greater defense spending, but particularly better spending and spending together? Because as we know, it's that fragmentation in that European defense space which has really been at the heart of many of the problems that we've been facing.
Well, there are a number of issues. Procurement and joint and shared procurement remains a significant challenge, and there does need to be complementarity across Europe. We should not be replicating in what another country can do. Clearly, our industrial capacity needs work. There is industrial capacity currently in the UK with important companies like BAE Systems working there. Again, that will have to be a shared endeavour, and some of that endeavour, of course, will always continue to be transatlantic, working with our American partners. So I think that there are, in fact, significant areas where we can work together. And going forward, just as we came together to determine the rules that should govern our global system after the Second World War, when we think about AI, when we think about quantum, when we think about further advances in biotech, again, that takes shared endeavour. And we'll have to do that at speed. Sometimes Europe can feel rather sluggish and bureaucratic. We will have to do that at speed. The urgency of war in Europe, I hope, reminds us of that fact.
Senator Vance, now, as you will have gathered, the prospect of a second Trump administration raises quite a bit of anxiety in Europe. And particularly it does as far as many of the themes that we've been touching so far, and namely Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, truth be said, the first Trump administration did actually see greater commitment towards Ukraine, and particularly greater commitment towards NATO. Could you perhaps tell us how you would imagine your party, were it to form the next government in the United States, how would it look at European security? Would there be a withdrawal from NATO? Would there be a pullout and abandonment of Ukraine? So are European fears justified?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me go second to last, because I had to pound a lot of coffee. I'm still very much on American time, but it's good to be with you. So I can't speak for Donald Trump. I can speak for myself, and I think that he agrees with what I'm going to say, but I can't speak for the former and I think likely future president of the United States. So, first of all, we have to remember that despite a lot of the hand-wringing, and I've heard a lot of it in private meetings and public meetings, Donald Trump was maybe the best president at deterring Russia in a generation. In fact, the only time that Russia has not invaded a foreign country over the last 20 years was the 4 years that Donald Trump was president. And it's interesting that so many people accuse Trump or me or others of being in Putin's pocket, and yet the person that Donald Trump says, or the person that Vladimir Putin says he wants to be the next president is not Donald Trump. He says Joe Biden is his preferred candidate because he's more predictable. Now, on the question of European security, I think there's a fundamental issue here that Europe really has to wake up to. And I offer this in the spirit of friendship, not in the spirit of criticism, because no, I don't think that we should pull out of NATO. And no, I don't think that we should abandon Europe. But yes, I think that we should pivot. The United States has to focus more on East Asia. That is going to be the future of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. And Europe has to wake up to that fact. Now, let me just throw a couple of facts out there. Number one, the problem in Ukraine, from the perspective of the United States of America, and I represent, I believe, the majority of American public opinion, even though I don't represent the majority of opinion of senators who come to Munich, is that there's no clear endpoint. And fundamentally, the limiting factors for American support of Ukraine, it's not money, it's munitions. America, and this is true, by the way, of Europe too, we don't make enough munitions to support a war in Eastern Europe, a war in the Middle East, and potentially a contingency in East Asia. So the United States is fundamentally limited. Now, let me just throw very, very specific details, okay? The PAC-3, which is a Patriot interceptor. Ukraine uses in a month what the United States makes in a year, okay? The Patriot missile system is on a 5-year back order, 155 millimeter artillery shells on more than a 5-year back order. We're talking in the United States about ramping up our production of artillery to 100,000 a month by the end of 2025. The Russians make close to 500,000 a month right now at this very minute. So the problem here vis-a-vis Ukraine is America doesn't make enough weapons, Europe doesn't make enough weapons, and that reality is far more important than American political will or how much money we print and then send to Europe. And the final point that I'll make just to respond here, because I know people have heard what Trump said, and they've criticized it and they've said, well, Trump is going to abandon Europe. I don't think that's true at all. I think Trump is actually issuing a wake-up call to say that Europe has to take a bigger role in its own security. Germany, just this year, will spend more than 2% of GDP, okay? That, of course, is something that we had to really push for in the United States, and it just now has finally cleared that threshold. But it's not just about money spent. How many mechanized brigades could Germany field tomorrow? Maybe one, okay? The problem with Europe is that it doesn't provide enough of a deterrence on its own because it hasn't taken enough of it hasn't taken the initiative in its own security. I think that the American security blanket has allowed European security to atrophy. And again, the point is not we want to abandon Europe. The point is we need to focus as a country on East Asia, and we need our European allies to step up in Europe. I appreciate what my English friend over here said. And of course, England has been one of the few exceptions where I think it has fielded a very capable military over the last generation, but that hasn't been true for a lot of Europe, and that has to change.
But before, I know, Ricarda, you want to step in. I mean, I think in a crowd like this, your point is well taken. We know that we have to do more. I think it's also fair to say that we actually have been doing quite a bit more over the last few years. And I think it's also correct to point out that indeed when Trump was in office, there was obviously war in Ukraine had already started back in 2014. However, the large-scale invasion had not taken place. However, here we are in the midst of that large-scale invasion. And yes, we have to do more. We have to accelerate that pace of doing more. But there is still a question that if the United States were to pull out, were to drop the ball on Ukraine in a year from now, we probably wouldn't, it takes time to do things, right? And so there would be a very serious risk, in fact, a very serious threat, that Russia would take over Ukraine and move beyond it.
Well, so first of all, it's very hard, the juxtaposition between the idea that Putin poses an existential threat to Europe compared, again, against the fact that we're trying to convince our allies to spend 2% of GDP. Those ideas are very much in tension. I do not think that Vladimir Putin is an existential threat to Europe, and to the extent that he is, again, that suggests that Europe has to take a more aggressive role in its own security. That's number one. But again, I go back to this question about abandoning Ukraine. If the package that's running through the Congress right now, $61 billion of supplemental aid to Ukraine goes through, I have to be honest to you, that is not going to fundamentally change the reality on the battlefield. The amount of munitions that we can send to Ukraine right now is very limited, again, not by American willpower or by American money, but by American manufacturing capacity. All of those back orders that I just highlighted, those are not problems in the future, those are problems today, and they provide real limitations. So all I'm saying is, in that world of real limitations, what is realistic to accomplish in Ukraine? Can we send the level of weaponry we've sent for the last 18 months, for the next 18 months? We simply cannot. No matter how many checks the U.S. Congress writes, we are limited there. Okay, munitions matter a lot in warfare. What we haven't talked about, of course, is manpower matters a lot in warfare, and we know the Ukrainians are very limited on that. So our argument, at least my argument here, is given the realities that we face, the very real constraints in munitions and manpower, what is reasonable to accomplish, and when do we actually think we're going to accomplish it? And my argument is, look, I think what's reasonable to accomplish is some negotiated peace. I think Russia has incentive to come to the table right now. I think Ukraine, Europe, and the United States have incentive to come to the table. That is going to happen. This will end in a negotiated peace. The question is when it ends in a negotiated peace and what that looks like.
Ricarda, I know you want to respond.
I would very much like to answer to that. I think if you are saying that many people who speak to you show that they see a risk with the Republican Party and also with Trump, it's not just by some imagination, but it's just by listening to the words of Trump and seeing by the voting behavior in Congress. And I think when we look specifically at the issue of Ukraine, yes, you said that you don't know how this war will end or when this war will end. I think yesterday President Zelensky said some very important words when he was standing here, and he said, why do you always ask us when the war ends and not why Russia is still strong enough? And I think this is the question all partners of Ukraine should ask themselves in the situation. Putin has shown over and over again, and he just showed this with the murder of Navalny on Friday, that he has no interest in peace at the moment, that he does not want peace. So if you say we stop supporting Ukraine, stop giving weapons to them, you're not having some scenario where this leads to peace, but at the moment this leads to two scenarios. Either you are prolonging the war or you give up Ukraine and Putin wins. And I think we know, and I said this beforehand, if Putin is going to win this war, he, but also other forces like China, are going to learn that it's possible for them to just change borders and that NATO is not going to hold up against this. And I don't understand how you can want the world, now I'm speaking about Trump, and you said you can't speak for him, but how Trump with his words wants a world where NATO is weakened and where also countries like Putin, countries like Russia and dictators like Putin's learn those things, because we know it is a world with less security and it is a world with less freedom for the EU, but also for the US. And secondly, if I may, I'm going to be fast, but if you're telling about this, you know, Europe needs to step up their game. That's true. Europe in the past, and many times, has not done their homework. But first of all, now we are stepping up our game. We have done this with the support of Ukraine. Now Germany is spending 2% on defense, and I think everybody in Germany knows that in the future we will be able and willing and need to spend more. So I think now this is happening. And secondly, there is a huge difference. If you are in a partnership, if you tell your partner, step up your game because we want to be stronger together, or if you tell Putin, well, they are for take, we are not going to support them. And this is what Trump told us. He wasn't saying step up your game, but he was saying, well, I would even encourage in this scenario that Putin attacks, and I think this is really an attack on NATO, and this is really a big risk for NATO. And therefore, we as the EU, we need to step up our game, but we want to do it within a strong NATO, because I think a stronger EU means a stronger NATO.
So
Priyanka, let me turn to you. Now, this was really supposed to be a conversation about Europe and its partners, and here we are again, you know, in our little transatlantic bubble, arguing away. Let me turn to you, Priyanka. In a sense, really sort of, you know, listening to all this, I mean, it is very clear that our world is indeed ever more divided. It is very clear that there are various powers, whether it's a multipolar world, as you would probably like to see it, a non-polar world. It is very messy indeed. Now, India really has been a rising player in this game, but one that tries to really put multilateral cooperation at the center, and yet it does so. Yesterday, India's foreign policy was defined as a multiple choice foreign policy, I think rather aptly. So perhaps, I mean, if you could react on the one hand to everything that you've just listened to, but particularly in this ever more divided world, you know, how is India imagining itself stepping up to the game?
So let me begin by first thanking you for giving me that voice right now. For a minute, I thought the Global South voice is lost again in this entire conversation. However, just to bring the perspective back, 85% of the population of the world is based in Global South, so-called Global South. 39% of the global GDP is coming from there. I come from India, and of course, I think multiple choice options and multiple partners as far as relationships are concerned, I think it's a good choice to have. To be able to be there and build bridges rather than burning bridges, I think is a good message that India is sending globally. Having said that, India is placed in the Global South in a situation where it faces its own challenges. Its eastern borders, western borders, both have two powerful enemies which continue to create trouble, create security challenges for us. Our food security, our energy security needs are something that every government, whether I'm in the opposition in India, however, but I do understand that these are the challenges my country faces. And for a point in time during COVID, when we saw borders closing, when we saw non-cooperation coming from, you know, a lot of places, India was a country which was sending out vaccines to its neighborhood countries. It was understanding its responsibility in the recently concluded G20. We were surprised, amazed, and we continue to be surprised and amazed that till now in the Security Council, we are not there. In the UN Security Council. But we were also equally felt responsible that we have an entire European Union which is not part of the G20. And we pushed it, and we're glad that it happened during our presidency. So yes, I think India does make a very conscious choice because of its challenges, and also as how it sees its role across the globe, being able to, I would say, maneuver through these challenges is something I think every country should be looking forward to and wanting to align with India and how it sees the world and how it looks at cooperation rather than confrontation.
But Priyanka, just to stick with you here, I mean, in particular, I mean, here you have with the sort of, you know, broadly, not just European, but many Europeans in the room. And I think it'd be extremely useful for this audience to get a better sense from you for how you imagine the Europe-India relationship developing. You know, how is it? It is very clear that on the one hand, India has a very strong relationship and growing relationship with the United States. At the same time, India considers itself as non-West, and that non-Westernness at times also takes the form of criticism of particularly, not just the United States, but I would say particularly Europe. How would you imagine, what is it that has to be done in order to actually get that Europe-India relationship on a healthier and stronger footing?
No, I definitely think it's on a healthy footing, and it is only going to get stronger because I see more convergences rather than divergence in ideas. We all face the same challenge with regards to energy security. We faced climate change. We faced democracy, challenges coming to democracies, and how Europe is battling it, and various parts of Global South is going to be battling it. So those are challenges we face: job opportunities, job security, tech, those are things where we see a lot more convergences. And having said that, yes, we are non-West. We are proud of the fact that we are non-West. And we are bringing a new idea to the table, which is hopefully gaining ground globally. And we'll continue to, if you look at our trade relationship, we're looking at the free trade agreement, which has been in deep freeze for many years, and we are now prioritizing that. And hopefully that should be coming to a closure soon. And I personally feel that there's only way forward as far as India-European relationships are concerned. Of course, there are going to be hiccups in the way, but those hiccups will not lead to hesitations in moving things forward. That is how I see it, and I would believe that democracies need to converge, and the time for it is now more than ever.
Thank you. Now, let me open this up to the floor. I have Sophie first. There you are, Sophie, one of our young leaders, please.
Hello, thank you everybody. The question I wanted to ask was about how the EU engages with partners. One of the themes of the conference has been the need for new forms of partnership, more equal partnerships, not just within the sort of transatlantic alliance, but across the world, as Priyanka was just talking about. And there's been a real theme of not turning inwards, listening to different perspectives. But the nature of the EU as a consensus-based organisation is that often by the time it has negotiated its internal position, its engagement with other partners becomes take it or leave it. This is our offer. I was wondering if the panel could reflect on how the EU engages with its partners over the coming years. What needs to change? How might it operate differently? And what can its global partners do to promote sort of stronger relationships?
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie. And let me collect several questions. Yes, please.
Thank you, Nathalie. Michael Fullilove from outside the transatlantic bubble from the Lowy Institute in Australia. Two quick questions to Senator Vance, if I may. First of all, can I ask you to reflect on the death of Alexei Navalny and what that tells you about the Putin regime? Secondly, you talked about the necessity for the United States to pivot to Asia. One of Washington's big plays on Asia in the last couple of years has been AUKUS, the agreement by which the United States promised to assist Australia and the UK to develop a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, including through the sale of 3 Virginia-class SSNs next decade. What do you think about AUKUS, and would AUKUS be safe under a Trump presidency? Thank you.
Thank you. Maida over here.
Maida Ruga, European Council on Foreign Relations. Question for Senator Vance. It's nice to hear the reassurances on NATO and European security. I wonder what you think about the dormant NATO idea that is being put forward by Heritage 2025 project and Center for Renewing America, which foresees US remaining in NATO, but minimizing its role to extended deterrence and handing over the entire responsibility for conventional military capabilities as well as leadership to Europeans. Are you aware of the plans, and do you think that might become part of the agenda should former President Trump be reelected? Thank you.
Thank you, Maida. And can you just pass the mic actually just here? Yeah.
Alexei Gonchenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. Obviously, question to Senator Vance. First of all, you said Putin said he supports Biden. Don't forget, Putin always lies. That's the first point. Second point, you said about importance of watching to Asia, definitely. But don't forget that your state of Ohio is exporting $11 billion to Europe. And what will be with 1,000 jobs in state of Ohio if Europe will be disrupted by Putin, which he clearly wants to do. And also, like the roots of more than half of population of Ohio, German, Irish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Polish, English, what to say to these people, just that you are not so interested in Europe right now. And the last thing about deterrent. Ukraine had a fantastic deterrent against Russia. We had nuclear weaponry. And because of push of the United States of America, you took it from us. So please, if you not want to help Ukraine, so help us to become back nuclear state. And we will deal with Russia ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps Senator Vance.
Well, there's a lot there, and I'll try to respond to all of it, recognizing we're relatively brief on time. So first of all, I'm a fan of AUKUS, and to respond to Navalny's death, look, he was clearly a brave person. His death is a tragedy. I don't think that he should have been in prison. I don't think that he should have been killed in prison, and I condemn Putin for doing it. But here's the problem. It doesn't teach us anything new about Putin. I've never once argued that Putin is a kind and friendly person. I've argued that he's a person with distinct interests, and the United States has to respond to that person with distinct interests. We don't have to agree with him. We don't have to. We can contest him, and we often will contest him. But the fact that he's a bad guy does not mean we can't engage in basic diplomacy and prioritizing America's interests. There are a lot of bad guys all over the world, and I'm much more interested in some of the problems in East Asia right now than I am in Europe. Now, to respond to sort of one of the earlier questions, to the question about the Heritage 2025 initiative, I'm broadly aware of what they're talking about with NATO, and I think it's consistent with what I'm articulating here, which is that we need Europe to play a bigger share of the security role. And that's not because we don't care about Europe, to your question, sir, to sort of the things that you've said, Ms. Lang. It's because we have to recognize that we live in a world of scarcity. When I sort of listen to these questions, and I listen to so many of the private conversations I've had, one of the attitudes that I think is very, very dominant at the Munich Security Conference is the idea of the American superpower that can do everything all at once. And what I'm telling you is that we live in a world of scarcity in weapons manufacturing and America's capacity to make the critical machinery of war. And that world of scarcity is what I'm trying to get us all to wake up to. In that world of scarcity, we can't support Ukraine and the Middle East and contingencies in East Asia. It just doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't work out in terms of weapons manufacturing. The one final point I want to make here is, I hear a lot of self-congratulation in this room and some of the conversations that I've had back home in the United States. This is not just a criticism of Europe. A lot of self-congratulation about how much our GDP is bigger than Russia's GDP. And yes, we are richer than Russia. Our citizens have better lives than the average Russian citizen. That is certainly something to celebrate and be proud of. But you don't win wars with GDP or euros or dollars. You win wars with weapons. And the West doesn't make enough weapons. Now, I don't mean to beat up on Germany here because I love Germany, but I wanted to respond to something Ms. Lang said earlier. Look, Germany is the one country, maybe, in NATO that did not follow the stupid Washington consensus and allow their country to be deindustrialized during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And yet at the very moment that Putin is more and more powerful, where the Russian army is invading European countries en masse, this is the point at which Germany starts to deindustrialize. Look at the number of people working in manufacturing in Germany now versus 10 years ago. Look at the critical raw materials produced in Germany now versus 10 years ago. The energy dependence now versus 10 or 20 years ago. We have got to stop deindustrializing. We want Europe to be successful, but Europe has got to take a bigger role in its own security. You can't do that without industry.
Thank you. Ricarda.
Well, we just decreased our energy dependency because we got rid of our dependency of Russian gas. This is something that Germany has done throughout the last years, and it had made us stronger. And like I said before, I don't have a problem with being told that in the European Union, Germany needs to step up, and I don't have a problem with being told that the European Union needs to step up. But I think the question is if we still have a common goal with NATO, and I'm not sure about this at the moment, and I think we saw this with this discussion here. But actually, I wanted to react also to another question, if this is okay, because I think we had the question was how the European Union is engaging with other partners. I think for me, we know that we need new partnerships, and we also know that we need to win, I think, trust in a rules-based order in this world. And therefore, we need to engage more with the Global South. To do this successfully, I think Europe needs to stand on 3 points, or needs to be better in 3 points. First of all, we need to be faster. Last year here at the MSC, there was some talk on resource strengths and stuff like this, and there was a foreign minister from Togo, and he was telling us, well, you know, everything you're telling us sounds really, really good, but I have the problem. If I want to build a harbor And the Chinese embassy just hears about it. 2 weeks later, I have workers. 4 weeks later, I have the harbor. In the same time, Brussels did not even respond to my letter. And I think this is a big problem. We need to be faster when we build partnerships with other countries. We need to be credible. I saw this very much at the COP conversations, how many people from the Global South tell us, well, we are only willing to do partnerships with you if you hold up to your words, if you tell us about climate financing, if you tell us about loss and damages, and then you don't put in the work and you don't put in the money, actually, we don't really want to work with you, or we don't really believe that this partnership will strengthen us. And the last one, and I think this is something that I also say as part of a party that is part of the German government at the moment, we need to be more reliable. And this also really affects us at Germany. In the last weeks, we have seen that in many cases, Germany has turned their vote on things that are happening in the European Union, that we have first said yes and then said no, and then therefore blocked things that are happening. And I think this has really weakened our role within the European Union, but in the end is also going to weaken the European Union. So therefore, Europe, but therefore also Germany needs to be more reliable.
Thank you for that, Ricarda. David.
Well, look, I want to do two things. The first thing is I'm not, as a British politician that left the European Union, going to tell Europe how to handle the Global South. That's the first thing. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to agree a lot with what my Republican friend has said. Russia has increased its defense spending since 2014 by 300%. China has increased its defense spending since 2014 by 500%. And before the war in Ukraine, nearly every European country was reducing its defense spending, bar a few exceptions, Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia. So there has been a problem. This is a wake-up call. And the question for us is, do we live up to those noble men and women of the late 1930s and 1940s who saw the peril in front of them and raised their game? Or do we continue to navel gaze and look over to America and say, you come and fix our problems? America has always had these trends of isolationism. We saw it during the First World War. We saw it at the beginning of the Second World War. And notwithstanding the problems, £75 billion worth of aid and a situation from America to Ukraine, and a situation in which South Korea is sending more shells to Ukraine than the whole of the European family combined, is a challenge to us, not other countries, to us as a community. And in terms of the Global South, look, you know what the Global South say. They say hypocrisy. That's what they say. They say, why do these people come and lecture us with their values the whole time? Where were their values during the pandemic when they hoarded vaccines and wouldn't share? And who pitched up to share? China and Russia. And look, India is not a middle power. India is the emerging superpower. Get on board. We need India, not the other way around. So this is a wake-up call to us, it seems to me, in this room, not the other way around.
Priyanka.
I'm so glad he said that.
Well, you can say it again.
I can only reinforce it. Yes, India is the superpower, especially in the Global South. And I would say the reason why I say this, we're going on talking about China. We are facing challenges from China. And we are a country which continues to adhere to international rules-based order. And that is something where we are facing a challenge with them not even believing in it or wanting to even try and attempt doing that. So that is a challenge that we face. And that is why when she said something like, what would you tell EU about partnerships? And she also mentioned something which said, take it or leave it. I would say, take it, leave it, deal with it. That is the third dimension that EU needs to bring to the table, that there is a country like India, which has multiple choice format, versus the take it or deal it method. So you all will have to deal with it. and deal with our challenges and understand that not every challenge comes from a European perspective. It also comes from various nations' perspectives and their priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been an absolutely incredible panel. I think it's really sort of highlighted, on the one hand, some of the things that we knew already. It is a world of scarce resources. I think we all agree that in this context, Europe really needs to step up to the plate. I think on this particular point, there is broad agreement. I think, there is also the sense that whereas indeed the United States cannot solve all powers in the world, the United States remains an indispensable power in this world. And we would very much like to see the US that will continue to remain very much engaged in this, and not only this part of the world. However, as we've seen, it is also a world, and this of course is the flip side of the coin of there being scarce resources. There may be scarcity of resources, but there is a growing sort of number of players that are making their voices heard, that we need to understand what they can contribute to the world. And of course, these powers themselves, beginning with India, will need to take on an increasing share of responsibility for the world's problems. So please join me in thanking what I think has been a fantastic panel to kick off this final day of the Munich Security Conference. Thank you.